All right, hello everyone. When we left off our last history session, it was 1962. And today we're on 1963, and here were the headlines of the paper. This was quite a story in 1963, and it was one that was in the press for many, many months. It also had started in 1957, and it was quite the story. To my knowledge, it's still unsolved. This is an article that appeared in the paper of two football players at Manatee High School. One of them was Richard Trapp. The other one was Skip Lujak. Trapp goes on to go to the University of Florida, and he is Steve Spurrier's favorite receiver. Skip Lujak, yeah, we're going to hear more about him. He's related to one of our presidents, and we're going to talk about that in a few weeks. Well, we're going to talk about James Brush, who was the president of 1963, and James Brush was someone that at the same time he was the president of the club, he was also president of the United Appeal of Manatee County, which of course was prior to the United Fund. And then he became president of the Salvation Army at the same time, a little while later. Now, he had an ongoing issue through the 1963, and that was litigating with the Internal Revenue Service, as I talked about last week and the week before that. And so they had retained a competent attorney, they were following their advice, and the club continued to donate money to the community while they were going through that litigation. James was born in Bradenton, and he went to Bradenton High School. He was an excellent athlete, excelled at swimming, and after high school, instead of going to college, he went to work for the Eli Whitt Cigar Company. Now, who remembers Eli Whitt? They diversified later into a lot of other products, but that was a company that was in East Manatee that a lot of us who grew up here bought a lot of things through Eli Whitt, and a lot of businesses bought things through Eli Whitt. He also went into real estate, and at one time he was partners in a joint venture on a parcel of land with, at the time, movie star Robert Taylor. And he served with distinction through that year. One of the things that happened in 1963, early in the year, was they had the club had ladies' night at the new Bradenton Trailer Park Auditorium. They had 250 people in attendance, and this is what the auditorium looked like in 1963, the new one. And on that same night, they honored R.M. Bell for his 26 years as chairman of the Bradenton Trailer Park Committee of the club, and presented him with a plaque that went on the auditorium of the Robert Bell Auditorium. This is an editorial that appeared in the paper during that time, and what's interesting about this editorial, and it came out just about a week after that ladies' night, was that Robert Bell, R.M. Bell, he objected to and opposed his name going on the auditorium 3 times, overruled each time, and even the night of the event he tried to overrule it and, of course, objected to it. But anyway, he was quite generous on his time for the park and made it such a success. This was something the club did in 1963. They had a tennis tournament at the Bradenton Country Club, and it attracted over 90 youth to tennis and had tournaments, and it was quite a popular event. This is Dewey Dye and Dewey Dye Jr., and I'm going to go ahead with the next one. This is R.M. Bell, Edgar Bell, and Robert Bell. And what happened in 1963, they had on April 8th, they had a club meeting, and at that luncheon, they honored the fathers and the sons who were members of the club. And it really started recognizing the tradition of families who have been in the club, and their sons followed them, and now maybe daughters will be following them. And so it's a great tradition to have. We'll recognize those families that have continued to do that. And of course, this is Kiwanis Hall, and it was being used consistently and all the time by groups throughout the county, whether it's government, non-government, business, other clubs, and it was being used exactly how the club wanted it being used. In August that year, the club participated in the Boys Club testimonial dinner for a new director that was coming in and a director that was leaving. And the club continued its support of the Boys Club, of course. And the other thing the club continued to do is they continued to partner with other clubs to raise money for the children in the community. They weren't afraid to get other clubs. They didn't compete with other clubs. We got other clubs to join us in that. And on September 10th, Marion T. Snooks McGinnis was elected as the president, who we're going to hear about the next week. Now, I'm excited. Our speaker today is Dr. Uzi Baram, and he is a professor of anthropology of New College. He's the founding director of the New College Public Archaeology Lab. He was born in Israel and came to America as a young age. He got his degrees at State University of New York and at Binghamton and University of Massachusetts. I got to know him when there was a diversity committee with the Bar Association, and I'm not going to talk anymore about what he's here for today, but this is very exciting, the work he's done in Manatee County on early Manatee County history that many people don't know anything about. So without any further ado, Dr. Baram.
Thank you, Judge, for the introduction. Thank you all for inviting me to come this afternoon. A bit more than 200 years ago, on this spot that we're at, there was hundreds of people living in freedom, having escaped from enslavement and building up their lives. We refer to this community, this Maroon community of freedom-seeking people, as Angola. And for this brief presentation with way too many slides, I'm going to tell you both about the history for this Maroon community and the process that allowed us, a research team, to find Angola. Some of you might have seen over the years some of the newspaper stories, some of the lectures, some of the proclamations by the city of Bradenton about this work. It was about a decade and a half of effort. You may have seen some of that over the years. We also, from the beginning of this project in 2005, wanted to make sure, because community members asked us to let children know about this. And so there's been a whole series of projects, both here in Manatee and Sarasota counties, in the Bahamas and elsewhere, that's meant to inspire the next generation. It seems to fit very nicely with this organization's goals. So I'll start with this process that came to fruition because of community support. Back 15 years ago, Vicki Oldham, a community scholar out of Sarasota, had read a pretty obscure academic tract about a Maroon community. It basically was at the stage of being a legend, that there were several people around this region who knew of something that had gone on here about 200 years ago that involved people who had been enslaved, slave raiders and the rest, but that was pretty much the extent of it. There was a couple of finds, including a big fire back at the then called the South Florida Museum, now Bishop Museum, land claim by Cuban fishermen that was rejected. They had this term Angola. But that was the extent of it, just kind of this vague sense that something had been going on here. I want to just note how lucky we were. This community, which I'll give you more history about in a few moments, only came about because of a really thin strand. Dewey Dye, who the judge mentioned just a few minutes ago, gave a speech in 1973 where he mentions Angola as part of the intrigue that surrounded slavery, U.S. ambitions in Spanish Florida, having been on the south side of the Manatee River. I've asked his son, I've asked others. He was interested in history, and somehow he knew this. And because someone transcribed his speech and it was put in the Eden room, others of us have been able to look at that and see it. Canter Brown Jr., who was working for the Tampa Bay History Center at the time, had found a newspaper story that described in 1821 the destruction of what was then referred to as escaped slaves living on the Manatee River. He pulled together some of that work in 1990 in the Tampa Bay History Journal, and myself and probably a couple of dozen other people read this obscure journal. Vicki Oldham decided people needed to know about this, and it's only because Dewey Dye had researched it that Canter Brown put more pieces together, and Vicki Oldham decided, hey, people need to know about it. They were able to engage in a research process. The hints of that location were incredibly vague for me as an archaeologist. The two Chaldees brothers, who are human fishermen living off the coast, claimed this land in 1828, and that claim was rejected, but it was noted, and it was noted as this name Angola, which of course is so evocative of not just the modern Republic of Angola in West Africa, but Maroon communities across the Americas, most famous being in Brazil. A map by John Lee Williams gave a sense of old Spanish fields, which you can see there in a much larger map of Florida. But where could this be? I was asked by Vicki Oldham, as an archaeologist, to find it. I had to explain it was never going to be that easy. But as I was talking to colleagues around this region, as we were looking, there were some hints at the Tabby House ruins at DeSoto National Memorial. A neighbor by Reflections of Manatee, the Manatee Mineral Spring, had found a bayonet from the right period of time. There was that fireback that was found by the Braden Castle at the mouth of the Braden River that the South Florida Museum had, and we were able to find some funding to do some underwater archaeology that found nothing. Where could we find evidence under the streets of Bradenton, knowing all the construction that had been going on since the mid-19th century? Well, what we tried to do, again, I credit very much Vicki Oldham for this, we started not by taking our shovels out, but by going to the community. First at New College of Florida in 2005, we had an event, and you see the flyer there, funded by Florida Humanities Council, where we invited people in the community to come and hear about what we knew, which was not very much. And we asked what they wanted, and they said, make sure children know about this, a little bit that we had. And so we moved towards sharing as much as possible, getting as much information. With the help of several generations of New College students, there's one there smiling happily in excavation unit. I ran excavations, and it took until 2014. That was a very long timeline for me. It looks real short on the slide. And then we were able to say, yes, there was such a community from the 1770s to 1821 by the Manatee Mineral Spring on the south side of the Manatee River. We put some interpretation signs up. I got money from Florida Humanities Council to do virtual worlds, kind of create what I thought it looked like. And then one of the descendants of this community saw the sign and decided she needed to invite her family members from the Bahamas to come. And Bradenton Herald, as says our Herald Trib, just ate up the Back to Angola festivals. The National Park Service asked us to put forward an application to the Network to Freedom, the Underground Railroad commemoration, and they approved it in 2019. I was so happy. So much of this work was getting out, it was getting established. We worked with Reflections of Manatee, which was founded in 1997, to preserve the land by the Manatee Mineral Springs. Sherry Spekas, who's a New College alum, worked tirelessly to help this organization and to put things down. But it was really these individuals, both Trudy and Jeff Williams, who created Reflections of Manatee, and Sherry Spekas, who allowed us to have this piece of land that hadn't been developed and it seemed promising, and we excavated on that land. My excavations were very small scale in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2013, basically weekend projects, and the Bradenton Herald nicely in 2013 laid that out, that we found remnants. But that's all we found. A sense that, yes, it was there. It was not a lot of evidence, purposefully not a lot of evidence. remember that happiness I said in 2019? And then I hear that the city of Bradenton is going to expand Riverwalk. And I love Riverwalk. It's a wonderful place to go to. When I saw the plans, I saw, wow, they're going to destroy the whole area by the Manatee Mineral Springs. What's going to happen? Luckily, and this is a much longer discussion that I'm just going to invoke now, all that work with community members, all those efforts, all that work with the school kids, with the newspapers and the rest, led the city of Bradenton to fund excavations. And in January 2020, I was able to lead a team and do excavations before they did the construction for the park, for the eastern terminal of the Manatee Mineral Spring at Riverwalk. If you go by now, you'll see how much bulldozing they've done. But they can't destroy anything because we did all the work. We talked about it as saving Angola, because that's very much what we're able to have done. It was massive excavations. Again, I'm doing this real fast so you can ask some questions, but I want to show a lot. We were able to go through, with the help of a really great team, with that funding from the city of Bradenton, through a tremendous amount of land in that what was then an empty field by the Manatee Mineral Spring. We not only had graduate students from the University of South Florida and other professional archaeologists helping us, but also someone who was, his family was from the Bahamas, was from the descendant group, who was trained as an archaeologist, Jason Brown, who's in the bottom picture, to add even more to our understanding of what was here and why it was important. Thanks to the Division of Historical Resources of the state of Florida, we had funding at the New College Public Archaeology Lab during the pandemic. So it was restricted who could come into the lab, sorry to say. Analysis of all those materials, and it was 35,000 objects that we had pulled out of the ground by the Manatee Mineral Spring. There's just some more images from the excavations. You can see the Manatee River in the background. You can see some more of the excavations that we did. Even more, Kimberly Horn, who's doing the landscape transformation, was kind to give us all this drone footage you see. For those who care for numbers, just in case, in one area is 50 meters long that we excavated, that you see there. The other was 50 by 30 meters, I should say. And this will only excite the archaeologists in the room. Okay, just me. But I'm still excited by it. What we had, you can see the ground surface. That lighter soil was from the mid to late 20th century. The darker soil right below it was basically late 19th century material. The darkest was from the mid 19th century. That's when Josiah Gates came and created the village of Manatee. That's actually one of the significant parts of the Manatee Mineral Spring. And you can only see little spots. It's discontinuous. The people who lived by the Manatee Mineral Spring were trying to be hidden. They were only here for a few decades. But in those little dark spots, we found some fantastic finds. I've submitted the report, but I can assure you there's probably another decade of work that will go into making sense of this. Where before, in 2014, I could say, yes, there was evidence for Angola. What I can say now is I can tell you a bit about their lifeways. How did people live in freedom in Spanish Florida from the 1770s to 1821? One of the things we found, and we did not find much that was kind of coherent, that was visible, is actually still a bit of a mystery, because it's a barrel well. And a well is not that unusual. It's just there's a spring right next to it. And we know from the village of Manatee, right, we know very little from the Maroons themselves. They didn't write about their lives. When the community was destroyed, it was just kind of wiped away. People did not have memories of their ancestors in any details. We know people in the village of Manatee did not build this well, so process of elimination. Oh, with archaeological work, there's never a problem with theories and people's ideas. The one that I heard was maybe the mineral spring was a sacred spring and this was more functional water. I will say, as soon as we excavated it, and that fellow you see in the reflection was just also be wet the whole time, that January of 2020, clear water would flow right back up, as it had 200 years before. I didn't let them drink from it, because OSHA regulations, but it was very clear water. And it's actually still there. We didn't remove it. And as they're doing the work at the park, they're leaving that be. So people can always go back to it sometime in the future. Again, the archaeologists in the room, just me, will see these little marks and know them as post molds. This New College student is holding up one of the pieces of wood that actually was preserved. And if you know anything about architecture, right, it's actually a nice piece of wood for a log cabin. These people lived in cabins. They were skilled craftspeople. And it's very nice evidence that we're still pursuing in the type of production they did for their cabins. We talk about in archaeology not what we find, but what we find out. And here's just a sample of some of the things we found. One of the nicest is a coin. A lot of the evidence for this Maroon community comes about from knowing the ceramics, and knowing the ceramics date from the 1770s to basically just 1820. And then there's later ceramics for the later periods of time, the later levels. But that's an argument based on ceramics. The coin that we found in the right level is sent up to the Bureau of Archaeological Research in Tallahassee. They cleaned it up for us, and they read the date as 1808, which is just perfect. It's actually a coin, a half cent, that when we looked it up, right, it's easy enough to look up this sort of information these days, America's unwanted coin. It was coined for a couple of decades, but no one actually seemed to really like it. And we started to imagine someone who was enslaved in what's now Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, could they have gotten this sort of really half-cent coin and kept it and brought it all the way down here? It seems like a reasonable inference. It's either a token or a good luck piece. Probably the most impressive find, I thank my colleague, Professor Rosin Howard, who's retired from the University of Central Florida, for the analysis. You see myself and three of the others standing where there were post molds. Right? Archaeological stratigraphy is really complicated, particularly in this spot. But at one level, there are these 4 post molds that would have been part of a cabin. When we excavated that middle area, we found 2 separate small pits. In one of the pits, you can see on the right, it's unromantically referred to as the G-shaped ornament. Still haven't figured out what this small metal thing is. It might have been held cloth together, it might have been some joint, but someone dug a small hole and put this in the ground in the floor of their cabin. Right next to it, they dug another small hole, and what you see there to its left is made out of glass, and it's half of a projectile point, arrowhead. And so thanks to, again, Professor Howard, right, some kind of, and again, this is kind of cliche in archaeology, a ritual behavior. I can't tell you what this person or people did when they buried it, but it's very much indicative of certain beliefs in West Africa that may have been connected to this. They buried some things for good luck. Sad to say, it didn't work. You all know that. Some of the ceramics, just to put a couple of pieces on. Surprisingly, that piece you see on top is the only one that's really handmade. The vast majority of the ceramics we find were British mass-produced goods. And when I first was doing the excavation, we found such things. It was actually a little confusing, because thinking people of African heritage living here in the Gulf Coast of Florida, what would they have? It was Spanish territory after all. They saw themselves as British subjects. There's a rich history of British soldiers organizing both Native Americans and people of African heritage in the panhandle of Florida. And one in particular, by the name of Edward Nichols, one of the historian, found a speech he gave in Pensacola, promising individuals he referred to as men of color that if they fought with the British, they would be able to live as free people on British lands. And so these Maroons did not see themselves as escaped slaves. They didn't see themselves as Americans. They saw themselves as British subjects, and they traded with British merchants who were coming into Spanish territory for British goods. We found tremendous evidence, and because of historical archaeology, having done studies for decades, very clear precision. The one on the right is one of my favorite pieces, called pearlware, tight dating for this time period. We also located pieces of glass that were flaked. Some of you know there's very low stone down here. The native peoples for thousands of years used shell tools and not stone tools because very little stone locally available to go north of Tampa Bay. In the 19th century, we know from Seminole sites that Seminoles would take glass, mass-produced glass, and flake it to use it as the ancestors done with stone. We find the same phenomenon here. You can see, and again, archaeologically, it's tremendously exciting. I'll say that constantly. Maybe get you excited, maybe not. Those marks show someone taking something and banging it against it to get a very sharp edge. I found several dozen pieces of this flake glass used for cutting and such purposes. My colleague up at USF Tampa, Diane Wallman, is an expert in zooarchaeology. What a trooper. 5,000 specimens of animal bone. It's a lot, is all I can say. A tremendous amount of cut bone, butchered bone, that's cow that you see on the left. So we know there were cows, chickens, pigs, squirrels. There was actually a burial of a possum, not sure about which level it was on. We know these Maroons had horses, they had cows, they had chickens, they had pigs. They were living in cabins. They were reconstructing a world here in freedom and liberty, far, far away from the Georgia border, from the U.S. border. But the kind of most exciting of her finds, you might be able to see what's circled there, this rectangle. That's a remains of a wooden box, a rectangular box. When we removed it, we found the bones of a dog. You can see Professor Wallman's sense, about 18 inches high, almost 50 pounds. For those who want, a border collie or Australian shepherd of that size, known as a Carolina dog or Seminole dog. You want to have a sense of these Maroons. Someone had a dog, and when it died, they put it inside a rectangular wooden box and buried it in the ground. As close a sense of their humanity, much more than the British ceramics, I think. Of course, they're right on the Manatee River with easy access to Tampa Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. Tremendous amounts of oysters. It used to be called the Oyster River. You find the ortholites, the ear bones for fish in tremendous numbers. Diane has not finished all that work yet. She's promising. Crab shell as well. Such a rich place to make a life here. So much food both on land and water, and they ate a lot of shellfish, I can assure you. We're still going through the materials. Some things we can recognize. Clay tobacco pipe, again traded with the British merchants who were smoking tobacco. You shouldn't smoke tobacco, it kills you, it killed them, they're all dead. But then we also have some things that frankly no one's been able to help us with. You can see the wire there with the little hooks. It looks like some kind of fishing net made out of metal wire. It can go back more than a couple hundred years, but no one, including our friends at Cortez, seems to know about this technology. And so if you know anything about kind of fishing technology, know something about metal hooks and metal nets, please share. Again, this is where the work is going to be ongoing and hopefully more and more sense of these people's lives. I had put together a digital reconstruction. We can actually walk through it. I'm not going to do it with us. But a sense of the water coming from the spring, the wooden cabins. We know they had British mass-produced goods, the Seminole-style glass flaking, a robust agricultural community with livestock and pets, along with the marine resources. While I excavated by the Manatee Mineral Spring, thanks to reflections of Manatee and their preservation, they also spread out to the Braden Castle and all the way down to Sarasota Bay to where New College and the Renwick Museum are today. Hundreds of people. Canter Brown Jr. believes that by 1821, there was probably over 700 people living in hamlets from the Manatee River all the way down to Sarasota Bay. in these this sort of lifeway. As I mentioned, it does end. And Canter Brown is the one who found a newspaper story that laid out a plot by people in the United States to take what they saw as property. Because this is the terrible part of this history. These people living in freedom were seen as property. And they went in, and you can see in the newspaper story, they arrived at Sarasota. We used Angola, that's another name for this community. Captured 300 of them, plundered their plantation, that just means fields from the time period, set fire to all their houses, those cabins, and they went further south to Charlotte Harbor. And this is the term that always kind of resonates with me and puts fear into me. The terror thus spread along the western coast of East Florida, broke all the establishments, and they fled. Well, again, thanks to Roz and Howard, we know that some of them fled to the interior of Florida, and they took part in the Second Seminole War. Others fled because they were promised they could live in freedom to the British Bahamas. And not just that we had the inference, but thanks to Professor Howard's work, we have the list of names of people who were captured because they were seen as property. Most of them were never slaves. So there are lawsuits all the time, who owned what. In the list is 2 men mentioned having escaped before the group slavery got to Georgia. In the group that landed in 1821 in the Bahamas, we see 2 of those names. It's as good as evidence as you could ever want. The people who were captured in Angola, escaping and getting to Andros Island at a place known as Red Bays. They had known about their ancestors, the Reverend Barton, Ms. Marshall, were elders when I first went to Red Bays, and they talked about their ancestors having come from Florida. They had a sense there was Tampa Bay, but not much more of that. We were able to fill in the story for them, of where their ancestors had been, and that's why the Back to Angola Festival was so successful. Daphne Towns, who you see there, who's a Bradenton resident, wanted to bring her family members in. And in 2018 and in 2019, we had celebrations. Of course, we couldn't last summer, and we'll see about this coming summer. She likes doing them in July. I show up when I'm asked. We know the names of some of these people. I can talk about Hector and Hannah and Bob and Nancy. We also infer that some of the famous Black Seminoles, that's the name they get during the Second Seminole War, probably were here. People like Abraham, who negotiated for the Seminoles in Washington. John Horse, who escaped from Oklahoma, Indian Territory, to Mexico with Black Seminoles. Lewis, who's just one of the more important Floridians in, we can lay in so many details. They were probably here, and I mean here, on the south side of the Manatee River. Vicki Oldham, you can see what I wrote there, lays this out as the spirit of Angola. We got so lucky. We're lucky that Dewey Dye was able to say something about Angola for reasons that we don't know. We're lucky that Trudy and Jeff Williams, out of the goodness of their heart, created a historic preservation organization and welcomed me and welcomed the new college students. We were lucky the city of Bradenton listened and said, yeah, we'll give you a whole bunch of money to do this work. And I can't list all the people who helped over the decade and a half and continue to help in providing a sense that this is important, that this work matters. And what we tried to do and always encourage in the Florida Archaeology Month this year was community-based archaeology, to get the word out in so many ways. Whether films like the Judge organized Finding Angola that came out a few months ago, the interpretive signs, video games, those are my kids when they're little at the bottom, spoken word poetry, folk songs, so much, and hopefully so much more is going to come out of this project. So thank you all for listening to this.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, what is the earliest date that you've been able to prove that people were here?
So, as a historical archaeologist, I always put together the archival and the archaeological information. And so we have some materials from the late 18th century, And we know that Cuban fishermen start coming to this shore. The ranchos is a whole different lecture, right? If you haven't heard of it, it'll take a while. But Havana was, of course, the major city for the Spanish Empire. It was a Catholic empire. And so there was always a need for fish in those pre-Vatican II days. And one of the places Cuban fishermen came was the west coast of Florida, starting in the 1770s. And they set up little hamlets. And what we know of those hamlets is there were always free blacks living there. And so we kind of infer that that was the start. The mineral spring was obviously a source of water. There was a richness to the river. It probably was vaguely in this region, starting in the 1770s. It starts building up. More and more people are coming here, knowing about it. And then because of events happening in the Panhandle, particularly a battle in 1816, we know some of the survivors came to Angola. And that's when it starts really building in size.
All right. And as our tradition is, we will present Professor with a golden ruler. It's a rudimentary measurement for your archaeological find.
First, you might have to take this off.